Hi, everyone. Welcome to Financial Inclusion Week. I'm Jessica Pothering, Senior Editor with Impact Alpha. I feel so honored to be facilitating this discussion at the top of what is certain to be a very thoughtful, engaging, and insightful week of discussions. The people you're going to hear from for the next hour and throughout the rest of the week, no doubt, are instrumental field builders and drivers of what we all hope is a new global financial system. One which includes rather than excludes, builds resilience rather than vulnerability, and creates opportunities for the 8 billion of us on this planet and future generations to live joyful, compassionate, and fulfilling lives. If that sounds a bit flowery or naive, I mean, that's why we all do this work, right? We wouldn't be here if we weren't all mostly optimistic that it's possible. So on that note, I'm going to introduce our amazing lineup of speakers. Here with us, we have Michael Schlein, President and CEO of Axion. Leslie Go, Senior Technology Advisor for the World Bank and former World Bank Group Chief Technology Officer. Anita Bhatia, founder of the Impact Commons and former Assistant Secretary General of UN Women. And finally, Shamina Singh, founder and president of the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth. Now that everyone knows who's presenting, we'd like to know also who's tuning into this conversation. So please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. Use that feature to ask questions, and we'll try to take questions throughout the session, and we'll also open up some time at the end. So to begin, this conversation is about understanding where we are in our collective mission to achieve global financial inclusion, ensuring that everyone has access to fair, affordable, and well-designed services so that they can build resilient and prosperous lives. And it's also about what tools and trends are either advancing that mission or standing in the way. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with my organization, Impact Alpha, we're a media company covering the field of impact investing. I've been a journalist in this field for over a decade now. And in my role as both investment news editor and emerging market reporter, just about everything I cover has a financial inclusion component to it somehow. And so I can say that in the past decade, and since the pandemic especially, parsing what's really impactful and what's not in the world of fintech and financial services has become much more complicated. There are a lot of new tools and technologies emerging, and many of them have definitely an inclusion sheen, but it's questionable whether or not that's the real intent or whether they're even showing results yet. Michael, you and the Axion family have fielded a lot of questions from me about this over the years. And so I'd like to start this conversation by asking you very broadly what the state of financial inclusion looks like to you, where we are, where we've made progress, where we're stagnating or backsliding, and why you think that is.
Great to be with you and great to kick off very exciting Financial Inclusion Week with this great panel. Several steps back, really big picture. Over the last several decades, in our lifetime, we have seen the greatest reduction in poverty ever in human history. Over the last several decades, we've seen hundreds of millions of people escape poverty. And for the first time in any of our lifetimes, those trends are going in the wrong direction. For the first time, poverty is going up. Estimates of about 200 people will fall back into poverty. And all of this is getting worse with the global climate crisis, with increasing prices, with supply chain failures, with debt crisis, increasing hunger, and of course, war. So all of this, of course, hits the poor the hardest. Now, at the same time, over the last decade, and then accelerated in the pandemic, we've seen enormous innovation and digitization and digital access. Over the last decade, 1 billion people joined. We went from 3 billion people being excluded to roughly 2 billion. So we made a lot of progress around access, and a lot of that was digital access. And then we saw in the pandemic, much of that got significantly accelerated. If you had the chance to transact digitally, you did. This is a sea change. So if you put those two things together, increasing poverty, but also increasing digital access, I think the work that all the people on this panel, but really all the people that are tuned into Financial Inclusion Week, I think our work is more urgent than ever and potentially more impactful forever. If you really think in the big picture, we could come out of the pandemic and truly accelerate the creation of a financially inclusive world. So I know my organization, I think the organizations on this, we're acting with great urgency because this is a once in a lifetime moment and we need to seize this moment.
Michael, you've said before that access is really like the low-hanging fruit, right? It's sort of the first step in improving lives, but that's not, there's a long way to go in terms of achieving meaningful impact, although that does begin with access. What do you see as having the biggest positive impact right now? And I guess just give us at a high level what concerns you have too.
Well, I'm very, very excited about it. A few years ago on a panel like this, several years ago, I was asked what are the 3 most exciting things going on in financial inclusion, and I said India, India, India. And I said, really, if I had a magic wand, I would wish that that the world's governments would build something like the India stack, which is really digital public infrastructure, and it really is the rails on which we and others are building higher level financial services like savings and credit and insurance, but they need to ride on these payment rails. And I sort of got my wish come true. Just recently in the last month, the G20, so the 20 most important economies in the world, and the UN General Assembly, so 100 countries in the world, all endorsed and all are taking some actions toward building digital public infrastructure. I think this is a sea change. People really understand the importance of building these rails and governments investing in this. And what is this? This is Aadhaar in India, biometric IDs for 1.4 billion people. This is a payments interface that allows fast, easy, cheap, and safe payments. And we're seeing that, I'm pointing to India, but we're also seeing Brazil and Cambodia and many countries around the world are investing here. And this is really, again, it's the basic rails on which so many other innovations can ride. So that's the most exciting thing to me right now. When you ask about, what are the concerns, I think with increasing digitization, we need to make sure that we're not leaving people behind. We want digitization to be both responsible and inclusive. And there are parts of digitization that can be exclusive. There are going to be people that are not comfortable, that are not trusting, that are not digital savvy. And we heard just on the intro panel just now, women are much more likely to be left behind, lacking cell phones, lacking confidence, lacking capability. And so we need to work hard to make sure that in this increasingly digital world, we're not leaving people out.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to come back to all of those points, and especially the digital public infrastructure topic. And I know some of the other speakers also have some things to say about that as well. But just quickly, just to sort of set up the hour, I'd like to ask everybody on the panel what, the same impact and concerns question that Michael just asked. And Leslie, I don't know, just give us your 1-minute thoughts on that.
Well, thank you so much. An honor to be here among esteemed panelists. Making the invisible visible with digital technology to provide financial services accessible and affordable for the mass is something that I care a lot about. I'm working very closely, especially in the underserved population in developing countries. And what is most exciting for me is the generative AI and ChatGPT as the inflection point that I hope would address the financial inclusion at the base of the pyramid, because we can scale the fintech innovation to reach the rural community that are the hardest to reach, especially if we can tap upon the automation with language translation to reach the smallholder farmers. Now, this already is getting piloted in India. We talk about farmer.chat from Digital Green and Kisan GPT, are 2 farmer-facing applications developed for India that leverage generative AI to provide agricultural knowledge and support to farmers. But at the same time, I am cautious and worried about the digital divide that Michael talked about and the bias from these AI platforms, because designing this platform requires a strong ethical framework and societal impact in mind, and also transparency and explainable AI in order to make sure that these financial service provider and fintechs can explain clearly how the algorithm work and the factors that they design these solutions for decision-making. And the transparency will also allow others to look deeper into it and address bias issues. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Leslie. We're generative AI, of course, is a hot topic right now. So we'll come back to that in a moment. Anita, please go ahead. Just your 1 minute high level thoughts so that we have some fodder for the rest of the conversation this hour.
Thanks, Jessica. And I'm going to pick up on something that Michael said, which was the need to really bring a sense of urgency to this, but also the really important point that he made, which is that this is the first time in the history of development, and certainly in our lifetimes, that we're seeing a backward sliding in terms of poverty. So if you double click on that, and if you double click on this issue of, how many improvements there have been over the last, 30, 40 years, you will find that when it comes to women, the digital divide is still large and growing, and it is not being closed at a sufficient rate for us to be able to say, we're really making progress and we're tackling one of the key constraints that the world is facing in terms of equality and in terms of harvesting value that we are leaving on the table because so many women are excluded. And just one factoid that I would leave all of us with, which is if you look at the number of women who own a smartphone today, there are 300 million women, less than men, who don't have a smartphone. So in other words, we have a population which is the size of the population of the US, which does not have a smartphone among women. And these are all women who don't have a smartphone. So the question of financial inclusion for them is really off the table. And so I think what I would want to infuse this conversation with is that sense of urgency and the need to realize that although we are making progress in high level, if you look at it as a high level, yes, there are 1 billion less people, but when you double click on what's happening to women, it's still not good enough.
Yeah, it sounds like, what you're saying is, of course, technology gets us so far, right? But that it's not the silver bullet, right? So necessarily. And finally, Shamina, please go ahead. Just your 1 minute thoughts at the top of the hour.
Really glad to be here and to help participate in Financial Inclusion Week. Of course, for the people on this call, and I'm sure for the people who are listening and engaging, Financial Inclusion Week isn't a week; it's a lifetime. And I think that, but this is an opportunity for us to focus our attention, focus our conversations, and I think, and most importantly, focus our assets. And I think that's what excites me most about I think this moment in time is that there are complementary assets coming together from private sector, public sector, and the social sector, all in service of people in the planet. And I think that, as Leslie said, we are at an inflection point. We can either incentivize a race to the top, or we can pursue a race to the bottom. And I hope by this conversation and all the work that we're all doing, continue to make sure that we all bring our superpowers to the conversation in a way that ensures that the competition serves the people that we're trying to serve. And we try to move to a race to the top, both in terms of our products, our services, our innovations, our guidelines, our standards, and our scale.
Wonderful. Thank you, Shamina. We're going to come back to that in a second. Michael, part of this conversation is around how to maximize opportunities here for financial inclusion. And I want to just come back to you first. You talked, because you brought up digital public infrastructure. And I find that in a lot of the conversations I have with the impact investing community, right, it's about where can the private sector play a role here in facilitating access to financial services and products. And often the public infrastructure and the public financing is sort of playing in the background of that, but often, sort of not necessarily always forefront of mind. And so can you just share a little bit about what you mean in terms of digital public infrastructure, and give us, you brought up India as the example, of course, and their biometrics campaign, and just talk, like, where is the private sector needed to build on that infrastructure in order to support financial inclusion?
So if you really, a few steps back, right? Traditional banking was largely you provide loans to people that had collateral, which was or people that had successfully repaid loans, which is almost the definition of exclusion. Microfinance really was a revolution in figuring out how to lend to groups, specifically groups of women, and then cash flow lending. And the real innovation that's happening now is the explosion of data and data analytics that is allowing us, look, in the world of financial services for the poor, it used to be that the distances were seen to be insurmountable. Now there's no distance that's insurmountable. It used to be that transaction sizes were seen to be too small to be commercially viable. Today, there's no such thing. It used to be that you couldn't know your customer and know her needs from far distances, but now with data and data analytics, we can really know what our clients need and find the right products and services to serve their needs. So the data revolution is thrilling, and the digital public infrastructure movement is facilitating that enormously. Again, India, I think, is the leader, but there are many, Brazil, there are many other countries that are now following, and they're basically providing data on and KYC, know your customer, for hundreds of millions of people. And so then you ask, where does the private sector fit in? I think it's the private sector that can ride on those data trails. And so actually, in particular, our mission is to try to create a fair and inclusive economy, one that works for everybody. And so we're a very active early stage investor in companies that are trying to leverage data and provide financial services. I'll just give one example. When we talk about 2 billion people continuing to be left out and poorly served, 2/3 of them are smallholder farmers in very remote locations. But we're seeing in the last couple of years some very exciting innovation in how we can reach them. So for example, there's a company started out in Kenya, now in 10 countries across Africa, called Pula, which is leveraging global satellite data to ensure smallholder farmers. For the first time, we can see when there's a drought, we can see when there's a flood, we can actually monitor soil condition, we can provide agronomic advice, and all of a sudden you can provide insurance to those 1 acre small family farms. This is a revolution. You never could do that before. So we're seeing great innovation from early stage companies. So that's the private sector building on the rails of this new sources of data.
Thank you, Michael. We actually, a question came in actually as you were speaking about how India is sort of unique in its scale and resources. The question is about asking how feasible it is to replicate their experiences in countries with fewer resources. Leslie, I know, you at the World Bank, and your role, as an advisor now, you have some examples of this in mind, and how, in other countries outside of India where there are aspects of digital public infrastructure in the works, and then also how your organization and others are building on that. Would you be able to share an example or two?
Happy to do so. We currently live in Indonesia, and World Bank is working with the government of Indonesia on a digital identity project to improve service delivery and deepen the trust in digital economy. We're also supporting the government for agriculture value chain. We see digital identity and digital farmer registry are examples of digital public infrastructure to have a higher visibility to the smallholder farmer who needs the support and give them the more targeted assistance to increase the yield and improve livelihood. After all, agriculture in Indonesia is about 13% of the GDP. So that's a very important contribution from the government's role to provide that DPI. And then, of course, private sector could come in to built upon that and provide access to finance and access to market for these smallholder farmer.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I was actually just about to, you answered my question before I asked. I was going to ask, because both you and Michael, talked about the smallholder farmer segment, and I think, whether you're when you're based, locally as you are, Leslie, you understand very clearly what the critical role of farmers is in the economy and securing our food system, but it's not always evident to everybody else elsewhere in the world why we need to care about the smallholder farmer. And so you laid that out very nicely by sort of putting the GDP contribution in perspective there. Shamina, I know you brought up at the top of the hour your the need for attention around cybersecurity, privacy, ethics. And so I wanted to actually turn the question to you, because we've spoken about, sort of the positive role that these digital infrastructure rails are playing in financial inclusion, but there's obviously a lot of risks as well, political risk especially. And so I was hoping maybe you could share some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think that the opportunity is enormous, right? So the notion of bringing more people into the formal financial system, 100%. And we're, as Michael said, and as Leslie has said, we're seeing that because the cost of technology is coming down, it's allowing for that opportunity. But what you heard Anita say was, in some respects, we're transferring the inequality of our analog world into our digital world. And that's trouble, that's worrisome, and that's troubling. And that's what I'm talking about. Whether it's DPI and the India use case, because I think India is a wonderful use case, it may not necessarily be the model. We're still iterating on what's right, what's good. And as Leslie said, Indonesia is trying the things that are going to work in their country. I don't know that there's a one-size-fits-all solution for everything, but here's what I do know, because we have worked in the space for so long, that if you're a customer, if you're a consumer, you need to be able to be assured that you're going to get what you pay for in a digital space. That's not currently the case in some of the digital public infrastructure offerings. You participate, but you may not necessarily have any recourse if you don't get the service you pay for or the product that you demand. I don't think that's fair. The same on fraud. What we're seeing around the world with WhatsApp, with everything else, is the amount of fraud is off the charts. And that's also the danger of technology, but it's also the piece of the puzzle that we have to really think about when we're considering digital public infrastructure and other types of platforms that are engaging the most vulnerable in our society, the people with the most to lose and the least bandwidth to lose it. And so I go back to what one of our partners in India recently said during the G20, when our CEO, Michael Miebach, participated in a roundtable with about 30 women who represented about 5 million women across India. And the overarching conversation was around, don't create poor products for poor people. And so I think that's the piece that resonated with him. It's resonated with us, is that we have to create these incentives that ensure that the best of us is the best of us, and our services are provided to the most of us. And so those are the couple of thoughts that I have around the opportunity around digital public infrastructure, but also the things we have to consider as we're rolling out different use cases around the world and trying to create standards and scale as we approach them.
Yeah, I think, with just the proliferation of new tools and technologies that are coming into the space, conversations that I have with folks, these questions about, what is the potential harm, in emerging technologies where we sort of don't have great visibility and necessarily all of their applications, is really forefront of mind. And so I think we'll come back a little bit later this hour to dig in on ways to mitigate some of those risks, I think. But thank you for sort of outlining them, early on in this conversation. There was a comment that came through from an audience member about going back to the digital divide and how this doesn't apply only to women, but of course, Anita so clearly articulated how women in particular are very disadvantaged in this, and how, but it also applies to people with disabilities, older population, and that a universal design approach is required, to ensure that nobody is being left behind. Anita, you and I had a quick conversation last week about where women in particular, but also some of these other marginalized populations fall into the financial inclusion conversation these days, and how worryingly it's not taking the role in the conversation that you believe that it needs to. I think, would you just expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, no, happy to. Look, I think what is happening is that policymakers today have a host of really big issues and problems to grapple with. And the existential threat of climate change looms large over all conversations. And because, policymakers are concerned about a trifecta of issues: climate change, the debt crisis, food insecurity, the cost of living, the whole issue of how women are impacted by all of this, and the need to urgently focus on all of these issues, including financial inclusion, with a very intentional gender lens, is just not strong enough. So if you look at, what happened in Marrakesh at the World Bank IMF annual meetings, of course, there was a launch of, some specific products for women. I was very happy to see that the We Finance Code came out. But are policymakers in a position today where they are able to put women and gender issues front and center of everything? I don't think so. And I don't think there is enough attention being paid to things that specifically impact women. So the example I liked, maybe the way to think about this is the airbag example. When airbags came out, everybody said, great, we have airbags that help to solve a really major safety issue. But were the airbags designed thinking about a woman's body? They were not. And so this had unintended consequences and then led to product change down the road, where airbags were then adjusted to account for the particularities of the female body. So we need to take that lens to everything. And we need to ask, are all products and services really relevant to vulnerable groups, women, and not just women, but all vulnerable groups? And what does that actually mean? Are we really thinking about internet access and affordability with a lens of vulnerability, and saying, when we talk about access and affordability, are we reaching that last mile? And then there are very specific issues, particularly for women, which come out of the fact that women have a huge care burden compared to men. So what does this mean in terms of the cost of their time and how they can use products? What does this mean in terms of their literacy? What does this mean in terms of their skilling needs? What does it mean to think about safety and security from a gender lens? What does it mean to think about data from a gender lens? And are we collecting enough sex disaggregated data? So what I'm asking for is very specific intentionality around vulnerable groups as we have all these other conversations, because without that specific intentionality, we're not going to get relevant products and services, focus on literacy, focus on safety, disaggregated data, and access and affordability that really translate into the capturing of those leapfrogging of opportunities that is possible through technology.
Can I pick up on something on Anita's themes? CFI, Alex Rizzi at CFI did a great piece on the bias inherent in algorithms as we lend to the poor, and specifically focused on women. And if you look at, many of the innovative companies that are building on that digital public infrastructure, is leveraging that data, are using algorithms that use how you use your cell phone to predict if you're likely to repay a loan. So people that top up their phone or recharge their phones are much more likely to repay a loan, and that makes some intuitive sense, except for one thing. Men have their own phone, women have the family phone. So guess what? Women's phones systematically run out of time and run out of charge. And so we are designing algorithms that systematically discriminate against women. We have to get much, much more sophisticated about this. We need to be much more gender intentional if we're going to make progress for the next 2 billion. So these are big, big issues. And it's the paper is great. The paper really focuses on financial services for those who are left out. But these are actually broader issues in our society. Increasingly, our whole lives are driven by algorithms of, what you watch, what you eat, what you know. So the world needs to be much more sophisticated about this in the coming years.
Yeah, your cell phone example, Michael, is actually one of my, it comes from your team, of course, but one of my favorite examples of the risks, at play here, and that this technology is very exciting. I find it's always sort of amazing to me that the women just sort of ebb and flow in terms of like importance in these topics. We're talking about 50% of global population. And Michael or Anita, maybe one of you knows, in terms of the next 2 billion of people who need to be financially included, what percentage of that is actually women? I would suspect more than half. And so I think the fact that it can be sidelined as an issue rather than being centered in this conversation is, just sort of shows how disconnected, the conversation can be with what, it's when you design products and services and impact solutions that center women, you solve for a lot of those other problems that we're trying to solve for, right? And
if I could just jump in and just give one sort of clear example of what an incentive would look like that speaks to this. We have an amazing partnership with Axion, where we're looking at embedding finance on the platforms that host small businesses. And one of the things that we are looking at there is this notion of providing lending or loans right on the platform. It's called embedded finance, and it's real time. It's money when you need it, money how you need it. Of course, there are guidelines and things that we have to do around that, but that kind of evolution and innovation that comes with thinking about what's next. Like, how are we ensuring that our North Star is always about the outcome? Access is never enough. Usage is never enough. If this doesn't get women and everyone to a place where they are experiencing economic security and financial health, then we failed. And so I think this also speaks to why it's important that it's not an either or conversation. This has to be an and conversation between private sector, public sector, social sector, multilateral institutions like the UN and the World Bank. But let me just give you one quick example of an incentive. When during COVID in India, when the government was dispersing relief funds, one of our partners we worked closely with to help them work with government to say that if you're going to distribute COVID relief funds, you must include phones for women, because that is COVID relief, is the technology tool to provide a phone to a woman. And so they redefined what aid looks like. They've redefined what it means to put women at the center as development leaders rather than recipients of development aid. And I think that's the shift in the conversation that we have to start adopting when we're trying to create incentives around serving the people that are going to lead this work. So I'll stop there, but I just wanted to bring that into the conversation because we do require we can't talk about this. We have to, I should say, act on this. And that means looking at our own programs, looking at our own policies and saying, what are we doing that's actually innovative and responsive to the times and the technology that we have access to now?
Great, thank you. Leslie, I know, I mean, we talked about some, taking action and some of the tangible examples and like, what does that actually look like? I of course know that you are brimming with examples from your own work and reaching some of the hardest to reach people who, whether in rural areas, whether they're women, whether they're, smallholder farmers typically, tick the box of both. The informal sector often, where small or micro enterprises also, again, often women led. Do you want to share a couple of the other examples that you have in mind?
Absolutely. So the informal sector accounts for about 70% of the developing country employment and consists mostly entirely of MSME, and they are the missing majority in MSME finance. So in Indonesia, there is a thriving economic model for informal sector, including gig economy workers and e-commerce enable micro businesses. For example, IFC, which is a private arm of the World Bank, invested in Evermoss in Indonesia as the social commerce to empower the informal workers as resellers on this digital platform. Another example is that related to woman-owned business is that MSME sector accounts for 97% of Indonesia total workforce and faces a financing gap of 21.2 billion. So women-owned business make up a significant portion of that number. And the business do not have access to the finance from the commercial banks and typically rely on funding from informal sources such as money lenders, peer-to-peer lendings, friends and family. So IFC recently invested in a Martha to address the MSME financing gap. So these are two very concrete examples in Indonesia.
Wonderful, thank you. Shamina, I'm going to take it back to you for a quick second. And Leslie, by all means, feel free to jump in and build on this as well. You mentioned you mentioned actually specifically embedded finance. And we talked, you and Michael both teed up the role of data at the top of the call. And I know especially during the pandemic, I felt like there was an explosion of this sort of embedded finance, sort of new applications of embedded finance. And what we mean by that is other services, whether it's logistics or inventory or farmer distribution networks that are then layering in, access to financial products as a way of including, previously sort of financially excluded populations. And I think, in the pandemic, it seems like a lot of investors sort of woke up to the informal sector and the rural areas and what the opportunity for their financial inclusion really is, since it's been missed, for so long. And what was the driver behind that was the massive amounts of data that these companies were able to collect on previously, completely off-grid consumers. I know, I'm curious, like, from what you're seeing is like, how have these applications, especially embedded finance, what do we know about the real results that those technologies are having? And yeah, in the role of data in sort of driving this increased access to financial inclusion, as well as, some of the risks.
Yeah. So look, I think that's a big question, Jessica, but let me just focus on on two things. One, the role of data. So, and I'm sure Leslie and others can attest to this. It's data is only as good as what we put in. Is only what you get out is what you're going to put is what you put in. So the importance of ensuring that what we've talked about from the beginning, which is ensuring that the data that is being collected is clean, that it is that we spend the time, the energy, and the effort to ensure that we've got the right data for the right purpose, built on a set of principles that, again, puts the customer at the center of the equation. Our standards at MasterCard basically dictate that the customer owns the data, the customer should benefit from the data, and we protect the data. It's really simple. And so we've built out our products and services in a way that allow that to happen. As Leslie mentioned, the small businesses are 97% of those who have the possibility to take advantage of financial systems and digital inclusion. I think the next click for all of us around the world is going to be this focus on small businesses. What does it look like when we're partnering with Axion on the platforms that we're working on together? It looks like a reevaluation of credit. How do you look at the behavior of a small business on a platform where there's so much more transparency and so much more of the ability to see, how a small business, what customers they're getting, what customers they're serving, how they're dealing with their suppliers, how they're dealing with their vendors. But most importantly, when they get a contract or when they get a service and they need the immediate capital to pull down or build their own capacity to achieve the contract, what can we do as lenders and providers and data operators and owners to ensure that we're using the power of technology and data to pre-qualify them or to look at other behaviors that can serve as proxy for credit score? Because remember, credit score is a created entity, right? And in the United States, we have big systems created around credit score. That's not necessarily the norm around the world. So when you're thinking about women or differently abled populations or people that don't traditionally have access to the system, we have to look at other models of credit. I'll give you one example. We have a partnership going with CARE, which is also doing a ton of work in this space. We worked with them in 3 countries, Vietnam, Peru, and Pakistan, to really look at looking at re-identifying how we look at women in terms of credit. So of course, in Asia, gold is something that women have access to because of their marriage. Because we're MasterCard, we were able to work with microfinance institutions that are members of Axion, but also regulated banks that are part of our network to provide risk capital to say, hey, look at different opportunities with women and other communities to help understand what they consider valuable, what they can consider as collateral, and let's look at building accounts and lending models, meeting them where they are. Again, this idea of making sure that we're always keeping the customer at the center of the equation and the North Star that they have to become economically, they have to be able to economically grow in the system.
Michael, brought up earlier the issue, of algorithmic bias, and how, he brought up a very specific example of how that has negatively affected women and how that is, possibly leading to some of this backsliding and financial inclusion, particularly for women. And I just wonder, we talk about these new tools and these new models, but we have to think about who is building them, right? And I don't know if you or, if any of you actually want to comment, but Anita, you in particular, since you're, working at the forefront of women in this space, is what the makeup of our new financial innovators, from a diversity standpoint, like how that plays a role in this whole picture and what's needed. Of course, the current financial system was, overwhelmingly designed by men in the global north. I just, do you have thoughts on what, who the actual innovators of a new financial system and new financial tools, what that needs to look like?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, I really agree with Shamima in that you need a multi-stakeholder approach to this. And that this is too big a problem and too wicked a problem to be solved by any one actor. So I think you do need this confluence of, governments, private sector, the multilateral financing institutions, think tanks, civil society, everybody really needs to be in this space, working collectively to drive change. So that's the first point. But the second point is, I think leadership really matters and representation matters. So if you look at this sector and you look at how diverse is this sector, I think you'd have to conclude it's not very diverse. I mean, you don't need to be a genius to figure out that women's representation in this sector is pretty low. And that is something that needs to be solved, because from other fields that outcomes are different when you have women in decision-making roles. So I think part of the kind of soft infrastructure, if you will, because there is the hard infrastructure that you need for this to really include vulnerable populations, which includes, physical assets, physical infrastructure, internet access, but then there are all the softer issues that have to be addressed. And that part of that soft infrastructure has got to include a focus, again, intentionality around having women in decision-making roles, having more women in the industries that are involved. If you look at the fields that are feeder fields into technology, STEM is still largely a male-dominated profession. Now, happily, there are parts of the world, for example, in the Arab states, there are actually more women and girls in STEM fields than men, a little known and perhaps counterintuitive fact, but this is changing. This is changing, no doubt it's changing, but it needs to change faster. And we need more women represented in leadership. I can't say enough about this. I do want to nuance it because I have nuanced my discussion and discourse around women's leadership to say it's not enough just to have women, but it's important to have feminist women who care about feminist issues and gender intentionality, and similarly, male leaders who care about feminist issues and gender intentionality. So I think we need to address representation and leadership also if we want to see change. And then just one interesting fact, when you look at what happened in the G20 in India and the work that was done on the women's empowerment, the G20 Women's Empower, this was led by a woman who had been president of the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry. So it was a very wise pick because Sangeeta Reddy brought to the table her knowledge of business and a business savvy approach to really putting digital economy and women at the center of the G20 platform. And so I hope, really going back to Michael's earlier point about his dream coming true and seeing this happen, that as G20 transitions to G21, we will continue to see this really important focus on women's leadership led by women in these efforts.
And I mean, I would add on that while it's important, to also to consider women's inclusion, I mean, that applies to pretty much every underrepresented and marginalized group, right? Whether you're talking about indigenous communities, minority communities in countries around the world, refugees, the elderly, and the like. And so I think that the more diversity of voices and perspectives we get in this space, the more it will be able to serve the people it needs to serve, right? And I think about that. Leslie, you mentioned how excited you are about generative AI in this space, and particularly in sort of turbocharging, what data is able to do. And, of course, my concern about that, the little to which I feel like I know about this topic is around representation and who is designing generative AI tools. I think this is a hot button topic, and I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about it in the context of opportunity and risk. And so, Leslie, I don't know, I'll open it up to you just to sort of expand what you're excited about. And then I know Michael and Shamina also have some thoughts on this too. So please go ahead.
Yes. So on the frontier of generative AI, and there's a lot that we could explore around the ways that we serve the smallholder farmer better, because we're now meeting them, in their own native tongue without having them to deal with, language issues, and then finding ways to automate that process so that the smallholder farmers who may have literacy issues will have access to all sorts of services, such as farmer subsidy, directly provided to them and available on the mobile platform. So I think the potential is huge, but of course we have to think about all the other areas that we talked about, biases and issues related to some of the concerns of what many people are talking about, ChatGPT, raising the bar on ethics and other issues. Because As I'm thinking about potentially rolling something like that in, let's say, Vietnam or Indonesia, we have to think about different data regime, data privacy, data security. We have to also think about cybersecurity. How do we protect the underserved? And many of them are women and also older generation of people who do not understand much about these consent that are provided to them on these platforms. So we have to think about ways to design these platforms to make sure that it does not cause more harm. So that's something that we're actively thinking about, because as much as I'm finding ways to reach them, we also need to be mindful of all these areas, because technology is neutral. How do you design in ways that will factor in the user's point of view and also the society viewpoint on this, and in the context of the country that you're rolling this out in?
Can you just say a little bit more about how generative AI is actually supporting that access? I mean, you mentioned that how it's helping to overcome literacy issues, meeting people, in their language or where they are. Can you just expand on that a little bit for folks who don't know how those applications are meeting?
In the pilot example in India, and in the farmers.chat, so there was one specific example that was quoted about the smallholder farmer who do not speak English and was able to find the information related to a pretty obscure government service, and able to get the information. And then the farmer said to the chatbot, I don't know how to do it. Can you do it for me? And they just submit that form and provide that information and then the workflow necessary. So I think that kind of automation is critical, because we have had such a hard time trying to figure out how do we serve these the population in the remote villages. I mean, let's use Indonesia as an example. There's 17,500 islands. And now with the last mile logistic challenge, it's really hard to get to them. And many of the banks are not are having a hard time serving these smallholder farmers because of high transaction costs and high risk of farmers with no collaterals or limited collaterals. And then when you compound that with older population and low literacy, the potential of these generative AI and ChatGPT can really provide the kind of services at a very low cost to fintech. They're providing these services to them. So that's still in pilot, because there are still many areas that we have to think about that need, on the data governance side, that are still work in progress. I would say in order to scale out, we need to test fully all the different scenarios.
I mean, I think we hear so much about this right now, and how, what generative AI is going to do for our future world. And, there's a lot of sort of also scary musing out there. Michael, what Leslie just mentioned, that these are all sort of early experimental models at this point. And I know you think about this issue a lot. So I want to ask, I mean, break it down for us in terms of, what those of us in the financial inclusion space who are doing this work on the ground need to be thinking about or worrying about, sort of what's hype versus what is reality at this point.
It's a great question, and I do think there is an enormous amount of hype, but I also think there's an enormous amount of potential of generative AI, as Leslie described. Chatbots just is a very good example of a way that you can really communicate in different languages, in very remote regions over phones, and you can build trust, you can provide advice, you can make transactions much easier. But we've all read articles about how generative AI can be quite hallucinogenic. I was playing with it the other day, and it was incredibly authoritative and 80% inaccurate. So I think we're just in the early days of the generative AI revolution. Also, I think, again, it goes back to the data you put in and how you train these large language models. So, for example, you will remember articles a few years ago about how facial recognition software couldn't recognize Black faces because they weren't trained on representative samples. Well, the same thing. Well, these credit models are trained on historic examples, and they may not be able to see good women borrowers for exactly the same reason. So again, again, we're doing a lot of thinking around this, and we're seeing a lot of innovation around this. But one thing that's very, very useful is a new toolkit for investors. I think investors can play a big role here in this emerging technology. And it's a toolkit used in due diligence, just put out by the Center for Financial Inclusion, on questions that an investor should ask about a few of the themes we've talked about how the data is collected, what's the historical bias, but also to your point about who's writing these algorithms. Is the team representative? Because guess what? If it's a bunch of guys in a room, they're not going to think about women with the intentionality that you need. So I think no, and this is sort of funny, but I think we're now in a new world where we have to go back and talk about traditional artificial intelligence, pre-gen, which is still the most powerful, revolutionary, I'm talking about AI, I'm talking about data analytics, machine-to-machine technology, the Internet of Things, algorithms and data. Actually, all that has been around for over a decade, and we're seeing a lot of use cases. The generative AI is getting all the hype and excitement, but I think it's very, very early days.
Great, thank you. Even to take it a step further back, you brought up earlier on about how it's harder to reach the next 2 billion now, right? And because not everybody actually is going to be comfortable using digital tools. We're sort of fast approaching the hour. I think we have 5 minutes left. And so I'm gonna lightning round the end of this, but so I would like, on those sort of 3 prongs, like where we are now, what kind of interesting tools are coming through the pipeline, versus, and also, what older model, like analog systems, do we need to be thinking about in financial inclusion as well? Like where do we go from here? What is top of mind, and how the private sector especially should be juggling these 3 things and prioritizing. Michael, I'll start with you, and then I'll pass around to everybody else.
So on the positive side, I want to go back to something Shamina was focused on, which is leveraging embedded finance. In the old world, you had to work with financial service providers like banks and microfinance institutions and fintechs in order to provide financial services. But now we're seeing, again, the role of data. And so all of a sudden, that's changing who we can work with. It's changing what we do when we work with them. And frankly, it's changing, who we can reach. And so all of a sudden, we're working with logistics companies and consumer goods companies that have reach into very remote areas, and it's incredibly exciting. We're working with a company in Kenya that's trying to revolutionize the medical supply chain on the African continent, and they are delivering medicines and using AI to recommend what products a small mom and pop pharmacy should put on her shelf. And then they provide the financing. The financing is almost, secondary, but it's based on a source of data that no lender has ever had before. So that's incredibly exciting. And with our partnership with MasterCard, we're working with these new kind of models to see how we can. Now that's all on the fintech side, but to your other point, I think we need to help modernize and digitally transform the existing institutions, the microfinance institutions, the banks that have really been serving the poor for a long time. We need to help them leverage this new technology so they can increase their efficiency, expand their products and services, and really reach the people who have been left out. There's a big population for whom all this new digital technology will not be relevant. So we need to make sure we don't leave them behind.
Shamina, I'm gonna turn it over to you next. I think Michael sort of teed you up nicely, but what are your priorities, and where would you like to see additional collaboration from this ecosystem?
Yeah, thank you. So look, thanks everybody for having us participate. Michael does a great job of teeing me up often for good things. So I'll say 3 quick things. On AI, think about it as actionable impact. And so remember that The incentives are around standards. So as Leslie said, creating the standards that are going to serve everyone, creating solutions in partnership, actually probably led by private sector in this instance around that, and then scaling in a responsible way with the multi-sector approach. The second thing I would remind everybody is it's about tech, but it's also about touch. So don't forget training. And so ensure that as we develop these products and services, we're remembering that it's also about high touch and it's also about the training. So don't forget about the training. And then the last thing I'll say here is just remember, this is about moving people from access to usage to security and health. So please remember to keep our customers at the center of our conversations.
Thank you, Shamina. We've got about 1 minute left. So Leslie, I'm going to give you a quick 30 seconds to add your closing thoughts.
Well, I think Anita said it very well early. Leadership matters and having more representation from diverse groups. I'm seeing new roles like Chief Sustainability Officer in fintech, such as Martha mentioned CoinWorks as well. They're doing roles and also GoTo, which is formerly known as Gojek, in the areas of increasing the impact with sustainability in mind. And that whole intersection of fintech and sustainability will address a lot of the challenges around climate crisis and build more resilient product. I mean, I'm currently at the Rockefeller Foundation Bellagio Center designing a new creative instrument to bring in multi-stakeholder partnership for carbon sequestration, to explore the possibility of areas around low carbon rice in Southeast Asia and the linkage to carbon markets and create behavior change with this incentive of the new financial instrument. We shall see how it goes. Stay tuned. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in, and Anita, I'm going to give you the last word, your call to action from this space and where you think we can all be more collaborative.
Thank you very much, and a great conversation. Thanks so much to everyone, and thanks to Michael and Axion for the invitation. Look, I will just end with be a bit of a broken record on gender intentionality. And I would just say to the whole ecosystem that as we think about this exciting opportunity at what Leslie called the inflection point, that I agree with her completely, we are at, I think it is vital that we think not just about the hard infrastructure, but about the soft infrastructure and what that intentionality means in terms of products, services, training, literacy, bias, safety, security. And if we don't get women at the table making these decisions, we are not going to think about things like gender-based violence and how do you create an atmosphere of trust. We are not going to think about women's care burdens enough. So my call to action to everyone in the ecosystem was make gender intentionality truly integrated into everything that you do.
Perfect closing note. Thank you all so much. I appreciate it. This has been a great conversation, and look forward to seeing you all the rest of the week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye now.
Thank you.